Out of all the other games this weekend, this year, I felt really confident about LSU beating Ole Miss. And funny enough, we have Oregon, Ohio State, Kansas State, Colorado. Then you had the Red River Shootout, like all these incredible games. And I still kept thinking about Ole Miss and LSU because of the context of the program around Ole Miss. Now, we'll talk about the winners because this isn't technically a direct reaction video to that game specifically. We're looking at the programs in general, but I will talk about LSU real quick because I do think they are very much, as Josh Pate says, a blindfolded kid in a room with a piñata, but he can swing as long as he wants to. And if he hits, they get a win. And how they play football, I think they made enough jumps defensively with the coaching staff and just being in the right position. I still think there's a lot of missing pieces. They're a very flawed team, but most of the SEC is flawed. And so in that space, they, of course, have a good chance. Knowing that they were at home against Ole Miss. Ole Miss has not had their bye week yet. They had taken that loss to Kentucky. And I'm going to more shift to Ole Miss because at the end of the day, LSU, it's to be determined. That Texas A&M game is fascinating to me, but we'll talk about that when that arrives. Texas A&M has to take care of business against Mississippi State, and LSU has to take care of business against Arkansas, which that's an interesting game of itself because it's in Fayetteville, night game as well. Ole Miss, though, let's talk about this program. What was seen as a popular dark horse contender in the SEC, a popular potential SEC title pick if you didn't want to go Georgia, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, one of those three. And even then, I saw a lot of people saying Ole Miss was better than Alabama. Now, obviously, Alabama hasn't looked great, so I don't want a bunch of Ole Miss fans coming into my comment section saying, well, you're comparing us to Alabama. They just lost to Vanderbilt. Not what the point of this video is. What we're talking about today is primarily Ole Miss and how they need to shift their expectations as fans. Because when the news or when the rumors began around Florida and Lane Kiffin, the narrative was, or what people tried to push was, Ole Miss is not a window program. This is a program meant to stay. Lane would at best be making a lateral move, which I think in the context of where Florida is as a program is technically a lateral move now, but with a lot more upside going into the future. The resources are better. The infrastructure is better. Ole Miss is just behind, and they're just not that level of a program. Infrastructure-wise, resources-wise, Ole Miss is a window program, and that's fine. 90% of college football is a window program, building up year over year with experience, coaching, players, guys that buy in, and then you take a huge swing at a year that everything seems to be ramping up towards your direction, knowing that you have a relatively lighter schedule than most SEC teams. And Ole Miss, and pun intended, took an old swing and a miss. Not a good look. So what is the outlook with Ole Miss in general? Knowing that they had bolstered their NIL funds, knowing that they had been so reliant on the transfer portal, they had gotten better in recruiting. Jackson Dart finally felt like a guy that potentially could become a Heisman contender, and they were asleep at the wheel at the beginning of the year. They got burned by Kentucky, which, to be frank, looks worse by the day, not because Vanderbilt beat Kentucky, not because of that, more in the sense of what the rest of their season would look like. They could have probably taken this loss to LSU and Georgia as long as they took care of business across the board, which for the rest of their schedule, I believe it's, Oklahoma, Arkansas, which don't want to gloss over those teams, but I'm just saying in the context of the SEC, you play Georgia, then you play Mississippi State to finish the year. And I believe there's one more, potentially Florida. That's a manageable back half of the year outside of Georgia for the team that was expected to be in this contention. And now you're looking at that Georgia game as a must win, or you're not in the college football playoff. This was not a team that had the expectations of just making the college football playoff. This was a team that was expected to win a couple games, and maybe they built up enough momentum from this, talent acquisition standpoint that they were going to be better than that. And they're just not. I look back at Lane Kiffin's tenure here. What's his signature win? Give you a moment, write it down, pull up ESPN, do what you need to. But what is Lane Kiffin's signature win? Ironically enough, it might be when they beat number 7 Kentucky in 2022. You could argue maybe it was number, I believe, 11 Texas A&M a couple years ago. There's like a bunch of like smaller wins, but there isn't that signature defining, almost what we just saw with Dan Lanning against Ryan Day and Ohio State. That's a signature win. That is your marquee win. I would even count Mike Elko's win against Missouri. That's a signature win up to this point, but he's also only been there for half a year. His signature win would be beating Texas at the end of the year. And Lane Kiffin, for the program that he has built up and everyone has talked about as one of the best teams in the country, they bolstered their defense. Their defense is going to be so much better, and it looked to play the part. I honestly said that their rushing attack, or their rushing defense, sorry, was going to be exploited in this game because LSU had all that momentum. LSU didn't lead for a single second in this game. They weren't even able to run the ball that well, and yet they were still able to get the job done. And at critical moments, and honestly, as Rebels fans, if you're watching this, give me your honest feedback when it comes to Lane Kiffin. What's the flaw? Because at first, when he first started at Ole Miss, I thought the problem was he was too aggressive. And when you continuously play that Dan Campbell style of football at the collegiate level, it's just not always going to put you in the best position to win. Sometimes it wins you games, sometimes it doesn't, and makes you look like a fool. But I feel like at its core, there's something missing with Ole Miss that I don't know if it's Lane Kiffin. I don't know if it's just Jackson Dart. You put all your chips in the wrong quarterback. Maybe this is just a bad circumstance of you're in a tough spot against LSU, and the Kentucky game is just looking over an opponent in the SEC you just can't do. And does that go down to the culture at Ole Miss? Because I'm trying to figure out what's the missing puzzle piece. I almost feel like it's the scene in Breaking Bad when he has all the pieces to the plate, but there's this critical middle area that's just missing. What is the missing piece for Ole Miss? Because they dominate on these lower level teams, but as soon as they played someone with the athletes and the stature that can match up with you, they lose to Kentucky. There's just no excuse for that. That's the same thing I would argue with Alabama and Vanderbilt. There is no excuse for that. Even if Kentucky is a solid team and they play Georgia pretty close, there is no excuse, because now you've basically shot yourself in the foot for the rest of the year. Because I think going into this year, I was going to pick LSU. Coming up to the week above, I was going to pick LSU, and they got the job done in super, super close fashion. But there's just a missing link with Ole Miss to be an actual contender. They are a pretender. People bash on Texas A&M all the time about being this overrated team that has all this hype. It reminds me a lot of like the 2010s, like Kevin Sumlin years, where they have this prolific offense, these fun plays. They have all this talent across the board. They finally bolster up the side of the ball that's been neglected, and it just can't get the job done. I get it. Lane is online. He's fun. He's an awesome character. There's a lot of hype around him. They're a fun team to watch. But at some point, we have to give them the expectations that they had hyped up for themselves with the reality. And the reality is for Ole Miss, unless they pull off a miracle against Georgia, and I would be so happy to be wrong, because that would be pure chaos. We would be at 2007 levels of chaos that we are already at. It's over. And I think it might be over, because I just don't see the path to victory for them to beat Ole Miss. With that being said, if it is your first time at Rush the Field, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to talk football with you. That's all I'll ever ask of you, is to give me an opportunity to talk football with you, whether it's a like, a comment, a subscribe, something to pop up back onto your feed, and we talk football sometime again. So thank you so much for watching. Give me an opportunity to talk football for the last time, and I will see you guys next time.